Welcome back to part 2 of Allan Legere, the monster of the Miramichi. In part 1 I covered who Allan was growing up, his criminal history, as well as the attack on the Glendennings. Where we last left off, Allan Legere was fed up with the Canadian court's appeals process and decided to take matters into his own hands. He would come up with a plan to break out of prison. Sort of. He knew he would never be able to escape the maximum security prison he was being held in, and needed a reason to be released on a medical pass. Then he would only have to deal with a few guards. Faking an illness wouldn't be good enough, so he started poking his ear with sharp objects to cause his ear to infect, and would eventually be referred to see a specialist in Moncton. During this time, the Supreme Court of Canada was considering taking up Legere's appeal for his previous murder conviction. But for whatever reason, only 10 weeks after the Supreme Court hearing, Legere decided he was done with the Canadian courts. He was supposed to see an ear specialist on May 15th, but the appointment was changed to May 3rd, which meant seeing the specialist at the hospital, not the office. And no one bothered to inform the hospital staff that a patient who was serving a life sentence for murder had an appointment that day. It also didn't help that prison workers were starting to let their guard down around Legere. Allan actually did well in prison. He didn't cause any trouble, and prison employees found him to be polite and easy to talk to. And the computer program used by Correctional Services Canada to let workers know who was dangerous gave no indication that Allan Legere was a risk to staff. On the morning of May 3, 1986, Legere was escorted by guards Bob Hazlitt and Robert Winters to the specialist appointment in Moncton. They would arrive at his cell at 7:40 a.m., but he told them that he was using the bathroom and needed a few more minutes. 10 minutes later, Legere would press his call button to let them know he was ready. The guards handcuffed him, and he would pass through 3 electronically controlled security areas. The driver, a man named Douglas Sweezy, searched the van to make sure nothing was smuggled in. However, this wasn't his responsibility. Searches were supposed to be conducted by the officer in charge. Before the trip, Legere was taken into a cell and a strip search was conducted, but neither officer would use the electronic hand scanner for the strip search. In hindsight, this would be one of several tragic mistakes that took place that day that could have possibly saved 4 lives, as well as millions of taxpayer dollars. Just minutes earlier, Legere had hidden a collapsible TV antenna up his anal cavity. The guards would also sort through Legere's possessions at the time that included a newspaper, a ballpoint pen, and 2 cigars wrapped in plastic. No one at the time thought this was strange, especially since Allan didn't smoke. It was a 90-minute drive from the Atlantic Institution to Moncton, and Legere was wearing leg irons, a body belt, and handcuffs, with a parka draped over his shoulders. The guards escorting him were not carrying a firearm. Apparently, this was a Corrections Canada security precaution to prevent a prisoner from potentially stealing their weapon. They were, however, carrying a can of mace. Back at the Atlantic Institution, an officer was supposed to contact the Moncton Police Department and let them know that a convicted murderer was on his way to the hospital, but he failed to do this. When asked why the hospital wasn't contacted, the officer would reply that he was too busy doing his job. The security system kept going off without a reason, and while the officer was trying to figure out why this was happening, he asked another officer to make the call for him. But the second officer would also fail to contact the hospital. The van would arrive at George L. Dumont Hospital at 10:31 a.m., and Legere would ask the guards to help him get out of the vehicle. The driver, Douglas Sweezy, would be the one to help him, and thought it was weird that Legere's arms were stiff against his sides as he got out, and no one noticed until it was too late that one of Legere's cigars were broken in half and lying on the floor of the van. The driver would contact the prison to let them know that they arrived, while Hazlitt and Winters led Legere into the hospital. While the 2 officers were filling out paperwork, Legere said that he had to go to the bathroom, even though he had already gone before they left on the trip. Hazlitt continued to fill out the forms, while Winters went with Legere to a washroom that was behind a canteen close by. but Winters would accidentally take Legere to a pair of washrooms across the hall that was mainly used by hospital staff. The bathroom didn't have a window, so Legere was allowed to use the bathroom alone. A couple of minutes later, Legere would open the door to the bathroom and ask the officer if he could find some toilet paper. And then suddenly, and without any warning, Legere burst out of the bathroom, ran past Winters and out the door, while screaming, quote, "Don't come after me." Inside of the bathroom, he had managed to remove his leg irons, handcuffs, and body belt, all of which were left in the bathroom sink. Legere was now on the run, with the 3 guards chasing after him. Sweezy, the driver, who was still in the van, saw Allan suddenly run past him. He would jump out of the vehicle and was only within a few feet of catching Legere when suddenly Allan turned around and screamed, quote, "Stop following me." Legere was making a slashing motion with his hands, and Sweezy thought he was holding a screwdriver. The weapon turned out to be just the TV antenna that Allan had smuggled on the trip. Winters, the other guard, would catch up to Legere and use the mace he was carrying to try and take Legere down. But Allan turned his head as the mace was sprayed towards him and started running again. Hazlitt, the other officer, was still filling out paperwork and had no idea any of this was going on. He only found out after hospital staff let him know that Legere had just escaped. A woman named Peggy Oliver was waiting to pay for parking in the hospital parking lot when Legere suddenly jumped into her car, pushed her over to the passenger side, and sped away. He told her he was a convicted murderer who had just escaped from prison and had nothing to lose. For whatever reason, Legere didn't harm Peggy and dropped her off 10 minutes after he kidnapped her. She would run into a nearby store and call the police, and her car would later be found in a parking lot in the west end of Moncton. The city was now on high alert, and residents were told to stay in their homes during the night. Roadblocks were set up, and traffic was backed up for miles. One report would come in of a man lurking behind a house. When police investigated the area, they discovered a checkered shirt was missing from the homeowner's garage, and a blue coat that Legere had stolen was left behind. For almost 2 days, police would focus their search for Legere in a neighborhood of Moncton that was half residential and half industrial. The industrial area also consisted of a rail yard, where almost 2,000 cars would travel through each day, and was also surrounded by forest. Throughout their search, there were multiple sightings of Legere, but he always remained one step ahead of police. On May 7th, 62-year-old Max Ramsey was attacked and tied up in a barn at a raceway in Nova Scotia. Max would tell police that Allan Legere was the person who assaulted him, but police were skeptical. Less than 24 hours later, however, Max Ramsey's wallet was found floating in a river in Newcastle, near the Morrissey Bridge, and his 1986 Chrysler New Yorker that was also stolen was also pulled out of the river. A few days later, on Monday, May 10th, a woman named Mary, who lived in Chatham Head, called police about a man she spotted outside of her home at night. She had just returned home from a night out and took off her jewelry and put it on the dresser near the bedroom window. It happened to be a warm evening, so her window was open and both of the screens were removed. She then watched a hockey game until about 2 a.m. and then went back to her bedroom. And then in the darkness, she suddenly saw a man's head pop up in the window and then down again. She felt that that man was Allan Legere. She knew him well. The two had once been neighbors in a trailer park just outside of Chatham Head, and Allan had also been a customer at the bank where she worked. Mary was so terrified that she bent down, crawled out of her bedroom and down the hall, hoping that he didn't see her. She waited until she was able to get downstairs before contacting the police, because she was scared he was still outside of her home. The man would vanish into the night, but 4 days later, Mary discovered that both her ring and pendant that she removed and put on the dresser by the window were missing. On May 16th, another resident of Chatham named Joe Ivory noticed someone in a field close to his home, but when he went to investigate, the person was gone. 6 days after that, a woman named Kathy McCure saw a man hiding in a ditch near her home. Kathy thought that this man looked identical to Allan Legere, who knew her husband, and Allan had also been to their home on a few occasions. A few days after this incident, a man named Michael Sproul would contact the police about someone he saw in the woods behind his house. This also happened to be the same area where the Glendenning safe was found back in 1986, and $25,000 from that robbery was never recovered. Police had always suspected that Allan Legere had buried the money in the woods. Then on May 27th, the garage beside Joe Ivory's home was broken into. A duffel bag, a pie, and about $100 worth of frozen meat were stolen. It was no coincidence that this occurred just around the corner from Annie Flam's store. Annie would become Legere's first victim of his murderous rampage. She was 75 years old and owned a store in Chatham since 1939. Annie was hardworking. Her shop would open at 8 in the morning and not close up until 11 o'clock at night. She had a brother named Bernie and was close to her sister-in-law Nina. The two would become especially close after Bernie passed away in 1973, and the two women would live together above Annie's shop. One regular customer would describe Annie as the most strong-willed woman in the Miramichi. She was known as a mother to the neighborhood children, always wanting to know what they were doing. And another customer would say, quote, "You went there for ice cream and you got a half hour of wisdom." On the evening of May 28th, Nina went to bed about 10:30 p.m., while Annie closed up the store. Allan Legere was still on the loose, but the two women didn't seem very concerned, even though there was one weird incident that took place only a few weeks earlier. Nina had found the back door unlocked. This was strange because this door was rarely ever used. On May 29th, the Supreme Court of Canada announced that Allan Legere had until the beginning of October to turn himself in, or he would forever lose his chance to appeal his previous murder conviction. This led to media speculation that the court was actually considering hearing his case. But rather than turn himself in and take a chance with the court, he chose to begin his murderous rampage, earning the reputation as one of Canada's most terrifying spree killers. That evening, Nina spoke to her daughter on the phone before bed, before falling asleep with the light still on. Just down the street, Kay Johnson, who was working at a pizza shop, saw a man running through an alleyway around 11:15 p.m. At the time, she thought this was a little odd, but not suspicious. Another neighbor, Rita McKendrick, also saw some strange activity around 12:30 a.m. Her house backed up to the Flams, and she saw a man looking through the window of a building nearby. She noticed he was about medium built and his clothes were tight on his body. She went to tell her husband, and when she returned to the bedroom, she saw the man walking toward Annie Flam's. At around 3:30 a.m., police and firefighters were called to Annie Flam's store, but were unable to go inside the building because the flames were just too intense. Annie's body would later be discovered in her apartment above her store. Her sister-in-law Nina was seriously injured but would survive the attack. Nina Flam had woken up to a man wearing a mask standing in her bedroom. He held a knife to her throat and demanded to know where Annie hid her money. Nina told him she didn't know, and he responded by beating and sexually assaulting her. When he was done, he told her he was going to burn down the house and make it look like an accident. Then the man started to light the clothing in her closet on fire. He had also lit a fire in Annie's room earlier. In total, there were 4 or 5 separate fires burning in the building. Although she was seriously injured, Nina managed to get downstairs and outside after the man had left the scene. The media always suspected that Allan Legere was responsible, but the police would keep quiet about this for the most part. They would only say that there was no evidence to suggest that he was or wasn't a suspect. And while investigating, police would question about 60 potential suspects. There was confusion as to how the intruder entered the home. All the doors were still locked, and no windows were broken. And Nina Flam didn't pick out Legere as her attacker either. She told police that the voice she heard sounded more like another neighbor of hers. She knew Allan's voice from his previous murder trial, and Allan had frequently visited Annie's store in the past. But Allan had a violent history and had nothing to lose. Police knew he couldn't be eliminated as a suspect. Annie Flam's murder was similar to the murder of John Glendenning. Both victims were elderly shopkeepers, and both had been robbed. And then there was the fire. Back in 1986, when the Glendennings were attacked, Mary testified that one man said he wanted to burn the house down to destroy any evidence, but the other two refused. But this time, without any accomplices, the attacker freely set multiple fires in Annie Flam's home. Everything pointed to Legere, but first, police had to find him. On the evening of June 1st, shortly after 11 p.m., Joe Ivory and his wife were turning into their driveway when they spotted a man trying to break into their garage. This was less than a week after the previous robbery, and Joe was furious, to say the least. They were able to give police a detailed description because the prowler was caught in the headlights of their vehicle. The next morning, a pair of prescription glasses would be found in the area. After taking the glasses to an optometrist and comparing them to Legere's prescription, police confirmed the glasses were the same type, style, and prescription as worn by Legere at the time of his escape. Allan Legere was back in town, and people were starting to panic. Hardware stores began selling out of deadbolt locks and metal bars to cover basement windows, and sports stores were overwhelmed with applications to purchase rifles. People were rightfully terrified. Allan knew how to survive in the bush and live off the land. He also knew the Miramichi area much better than the police. Mounties were frequently spotted in the town of Chatham Head. Helicopters, dogs, and search teams also combed the area, but nothing turned up. Investigators even pressured Legere's friends for information, but if they knew something, they didn't tell the police. Crime Stoppers also set up a $2,000 reward for information leading to Legere's arrest, but the trail seemed to be running cold. By late July, the RCMP believed that Legere was no longer in the Miramichi, and many residents were starting to feel the same way. Sightings of him had stopped after he was spotted in the area where John Glendenning's safe was located. But behind the scenes, forensic investigators were attempting to prove that Legere had killed Annie Flam. DNA was a fairly new technology back in 1989 and had never been used to convict someone of murder in Canada. There was also the added issue that the labs recommended or accepted by the courts were completely backlogged until 1990. The summer of 1989 was pretty quiet, and there were no reported sightings of Allan Legere during this time. But in August, someone did set fire to the mayor of Newcastle's home and his mother-in-law's, who the mayor lived next door to. Fortunately, nobody was injured. But then, on October 1st, which was coincidentally the deadline for Legere's Supreme Court appeal, all hell would break loose in the Miramichi. 70-year-old Morrissey Duran was attacked in his home by a man who broke in through his basement window. The man was wearing dark clothing and a ski mask and told Duran he wanted money. But instead of giving the intruder what he wanted, the elderly man fought back. Morrissey would end up being shot in the back by the intruder, but fortunately would survive the attack. A similar home invasion would occur just 24 hours later and down the street from the Morrissey home. 76-year-old Edwin Russell and his wife, 63-year-old Evangeline, would be attacked in their home. Fortunately, both would survive, and police would be called to the scene. That same evening, another call of a break-and-enter would come through. Apparently, someone had tried to break into the home of Todd Matchett's father, who lived only 2 miles away. And for whatever reason, police felt that these attacks had nothing to do with either Allan Legere or Annie Flam's murder, saying that these incidents seemed too amateurish in comparison. Legere's next victims would be 45-year-old Donna Donnie and her younger sister, 41-year-old Linda. They lived in Newcastle their entire life and still lived in their childhood home. Neighbors would describe the sisters as quiet, and mostly kept to themselves. Like most people in the area, the sisters knew that Allan Legere was back in the Miramichi. However, they didn't take any extra security precautions. October the 13th, 1989, which also by coincidence happened to be Friday the 13th, began like any other day for the two women. That evening, the sisters had a drink together. Then Linda left to have a coffee with a friend who lived a short walking distance away. By 11 p.m., Linda was on her way home, but had no idea she was walking into a trap. She was only a few feet from her back door when Allan Legere attacked her. Her blood would later be found on the ground, and her gold earrings and broken glasses were found on the driveway. Legere would then break into the house through a screen door and attack Donna. She would fight back, but was overpowered by Legere. At one point, she was able to break free and tried to run upstairs, but Legere responded by grabbing her by the hair and slamming her head up against the wall. By this point, Donna had suffered fractures to both her upper and lower jaw. Her nose had been broken, 5 ribs were shattered, and she had a broken blood vessel to the brain. She was unconscious, but still alive. But Allan Legere wasn't done yet. He would then pull out a knife and slash at Donna's chest and face, and then he sexually assaulted her. The attack would go on until almost sunrise the next day. And then, in the early morning hours, Legere would open Linda's closet, light her clothing on fire, and then shut the door. It wasn't long before police and firefighters arrived on the scene, and after working to put out the blaze for about 3 hours, the bodies of the two sisters were discovered in the remains of the house. At first it was suspected that the fire was just an accident, until police and firefighters got a closer look at their bodies. The eyes of the women were swollen, bruised, and puffy. The pathologist who examined the bodies of both the sisters, and who would later testify at the trial of Allan Legere, said that the sisters died in extreme pain from the beatings. Right away, there was media speculation that this fire was connected to the fire at the Flam residence 5 months earlier. But police weren't convinced of this because they felt Allan Legere was no longer in the area. However, a few days later, the investigation was turned over from local police to the RCMP. And it was confirmed that Legere was on the list of prime suspects in the murder of the sisters and Annie Flam. There were just way too many similarities. The victims were attacked late at night, they were tortured and sexually assaulted, and the houses were set on fire in an attempt to destroy the evidence. People were so frightened that the town council of Newcastle banned trick-or-treating on Halloween and issued a warning that anyone wearing a mask on Halloween would be stopped and questioned by police. By mid-October, the RCMP had received over 300 calls from people who claimed to have spotted Legere since he escaped. Federal politicians were even starting to get involved, with George Rideout, the Liberal MP of Moncton, standing up in the House of Commons and asking for more help for the police working on the Miramichi murders, as the RCMP in New Brunswick were short-staffed. The funeral for the Donnie sisters was held on October 18th, and over 100 people would attend the service. Reverend Barry Thorley read the eulogy and told the congregation not to lose hope. And that very same evening, a town hall was organized by CBC Radio, with over 300 people attending. The citizens of the Miramichi were fed up. The RCMP would use tracking dogs, helicopters, emergency response teams, and other personnel to search the woods, but found nothing and nobody. Police decided to stop wasting time searching the forest and add more officers to the streets of Newcastle, thinking that this was the best way to ease the public's fears. However, this would end up being a horrible mistake. If they kept searching the forest, they would have found multiple random campsites in southeast Chatham that were hidden by the trees from the air. These campsites were built with scraps of plastic, a stolen tarp, and trees shaped in the form of a teepee. It would later be discovered that these campsites were the work of Allan Legere. He would move to a different site each night to avoid getting caught. Meanwhile, the crime lab in Ottawa had some good news regarding the DNA samples that were gathered from both murder scenes, and the RCMP would tell the media what most people already suspected. It would be confirmed that Annie Flam and the Donny sisters were murdered by the same person. A prepared media statement would read, quote, Allan Legere continues to be a suspect in this murder investigation, and a warrant continues to be held by the Moncton Police Department for his escape from lawful custody. Everything would change, though, on November 17th. The RCMP would hold a press conference confirming that the DNA from the murder scene was tested and was linked to Allan Legere. Legere's next victim would be Reverend James Smith. Reverend Smith was described as a man who loved to meet people, loved to travel, and loved the community of Chatham Head. He had been a priest for 44 years and had worked in Chatham Head for the last 19 years. He grew up in Lower Newcastle and came from a large family of 9 brothers and sisters. Throughout the hunt for Allan Legere, the priest seemed calm and told his congregation to embrace their faith over fear. Reverend Smith lived alone in Newcastle, and when those close to him tried to convince him to move to a rectory in Chatham for his safety, he chose not to, saying, quote, How would it look to my parishioners? Me leaving and them having to stay in their homes. But a few days after this conversation, 2 RCMP officers would be outside of Father James' home, focusing their search for Legere in that area. Legere was starting to break. It was the beginning of winter in New Brunswick, and living in the woods just wasn't realistic anymore. And on November 15th, 1989, he tried to break into the Blessed Virgin Mary Church to hide out. But Father Smith interrupted him after hearing a suspicious noise outside. What he heard turned out to be a ladder banging up against the side of the garage. Legere would attack the elderly priest and demanded he open the safe. And when he didn't get what he wanted, Legere pulled out a knife and began stabbing Father Smith. When Legere grew tired of stabbing, he started to kick his victim. The beating was so brutal that all of Father Smith's ribs were broken. And when he was done, Legere ran around the house, leaving a trail of blood on the walls and carpet behind him. He was searching for anything he could use to break the safe open. He would find an axe, a crowbar, a drill, and a chisel from the garage, but they were pretty much useless. He even tried to hack his way in through the wall and open the safe from the back, but of course, that didn't work either. It would be almost morning before he was ready to give up, and Legere would search the house from top to bottom to make sure that he left no evidence behind. He had worn gloves, so he wasn't worried about leaving fingerprints, but his boots were covered with blood, so he removed them and washed them in the sink. Legere would then change and stuff his bloody clothing into a bag that he brought with him. He was confident that he left nothing behind that would implicate him. However, while he was frantically running around the house, he would step on a magazine that was lying on the floor and left behind a bloody imprint of his boot. He then stole Father Smith's car and immediately left the Miramichi area. One neighbor would later come forward and say that she saw a man with long hair speeding away from the church in the priest's vehicle around 6:45 p.m. By 7 p.m. that evening, a small crowd of parishioners had gathered outside the church for evening service and thought it was odd that Father Smith was late. This was completely unlike him. After about 15 minutes, a man named Nick Veriker decided to go check the rectory. He would go to the back door and find it unlocked. The light switch also wasn't working. However, even in the darkness, Nick could tell that something wasn't right. It was obvious that there had been a struggle. The kitchen was a mess, and there was blood all over the walls and floor. Father Smith would be found in the rectory office, lying face down, with a pool of blood by his head. It was obvious that the priest had been murdered. This time, the police didn't hold back any relevant information and released a 2-page report to the media of what they knew. The CBC and a local newspaper, the Miramichi Leader, also announced that police had narrowed down their list of suspects to one man, Allan Legere. And a few days after the murder of Father Smith, police released information that Legere might be working with at least one accomplice. A composite drawing of the second man would be released to the public, although police didn't have a clue who he was. Back in the Miramichi, fear had turned into anger towards the police and their inability to catch Legere. And some residents were threatening to take the law into their own hands. By now, over 100 police were looking for Legere and referred to him in the media as one of the most dangerous and wanted criminals in Canada. And the price for Legere's capture was growing, with Crime Stoppers offering a $50,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of Allan Legere, and another $50,000 for information to help end the crime wave in the Miramichi. A sketch of the so-called accomplice would be released by the RCMP. The man looked to be about 20 to 25 years old, 6 feet tall, a thin build, with a long face and nose, as well as what looked like acne scars or moles on his face. Investigators always felt that somebody was helping Legere evade capture, although they could never prove it. But Police Chief Dan Allan thought differently. He felt that the sketch looked exactly like Allan Legere, except about 40 pounds lighter, which was a strong possibility, as he had been on the run, living in the woods and stealing food to survive since May. On November 20th, the Miramichi would have its first snowstorm of the year. Legere was already struggling due to the weather, but now living in the woods was next to impossible. 3 days later in St. John, about 170 miles away from the Miramichi, a taxi driver named Ron Gomick picked up a passenger looking to travel to Moncton. When Ron told him that the fare would be $100, the man responded with, quote, "We're going to Moncton," and pulled out a sawed-off shotgun. As they drove away, the passenger would say calmly, "I'm the one they're looking for. I'm Allan Legere. And if your dispatcher sends anyone, the moment a cruiser pulls us over, it's over for you." He told Ron that he wanted to go to Chatham, stay in a motel until about 6 o'clock, then go to the airport and hijack a plane to Iran. Ron was calm and agreed to take Legere where he wanted, although he was sure that Legere would never let him go. Allan would ramble throughout the drive about the cops and how stupid they were, and how he could no longer stay in the woods because the temperature was dropping. He also denied committing the 4 murders. Throughout the drive, Ron would say nothing and tried to focus on the road, because driving conditions were horrible. Blowing snow was forcing the traffic to slow down. But Legere didn't care about the bad weather, and ordered the cab driver to drive the speed limit, which inevitably caused the car to spin out and hit a snowbank. Now Legere was angry, and forced Ron out of the vehicle to the side of the road, where they would flag down another car asking for help. Michelle Mercer would pull over when she noticed a taxi in the ditch and 2 men waving their arms by the side of the road. But the moment they got in the car, she sensed that something wasn't right. The smaller of the 2 men would then pull out a gun and say, quote, "Please do as I say. I'm the one they're looking for. I'm Allan Legere." Once again, he ordered the driver to drive to Moncton, but the road conditions were deteriorating. He then changed his mind and said he wanted to go to Chatham, and again denied that he killed anybody. Finally, Michelle would tell Legere that the car was running out of gas, and they pulled into an Irving gas station and restaurant on the Trans-Canada Highway. Legere would grab the car keys and some money from Michelle and walked into the store to pay for the gas. But just as he was about to walk out, the car took off. What Legere didn't know was that Michelle had an extra set of keys. While Legere was paying for the gas, she would turn to Ron and ask him if he wanted to go for it. Ron agreed, and the 2 sped out of the gas station and headed for the RCMP dispatchman in Sussex. Within minutes, police were on the scene at the gas station. A province-wide alert was issued, and roadblocks were set up. But little did they know that Allan Legere had found a new hostage. After Michelle and Ron escaped, Legere spotted Brian Golding cleaning the windshield of his Mack truck. Once again, he would pull out his gun and demand to be taken to Moncton. Brian did as he was told, but he couldn't drive very fast because the driving conditions were dangerous and he was towing a heavy load. The men would drive all night and into the early morning hours. And then about 4 miles south of Newcastle, Legere told Golding to turn left on Route 118, which was a side road that ran along the Miramichi River. What he didn't know was that another trucker spotted the tractor trailer going down this road, which was not a road normally used by these types of trucks. The trucker was suspicious and called the police on his CB radio. When police located the vehicle, Golding told Legere that he didn't think he could keep going. Legere must have realized that the jig was up. Brian was allowed to exit the truck, and Allan Legere was finally captured on November 24, 1989. And there was more good news. The RCMP now believed that Legere didn't have any accomplices in the killings, and that the skinny man in the police sketch was actually a slimmed-down version of Legere, who lost between 35 to 40 pounds during his time on the run. The nightmare was finally over for the residents of the Miramichi, and law enforcement were taking no chances when it came to Legere. They knew he might try to escape again. Heavily armed police would accompany Legere to his first court appearance on the charge of escaping custody, before sending him back to his maximum security prison to continue serving his life sentence. But first, Legere would face an angry mob outside of the courthouse. However, it didn't seem to bother him. Allan seemed more upset that his TV back at the Atlantic Institution had been confiscated by police. Inside of it, they would find a buttload of metal pieces that had been molded into handcuff keys. Legere would waste everybody's time at the trial, of course, and pleaded not guilty to escaping custody. He insisted on testifying in his own defense, and told the court that he made the 3 jailers from whom he escaped look like the 3 Stooges. His exact words were, they were too old, too fat, and too stupid to catch him. But on August 14, 1990, after a jury deliberated for 6 hours, Legere was found guilty of escaping custody. However, it didn't really matter though. Legere was already serving a life sentence for his previous murder conviction. He would be sentenced to 9 years to be served concurrently with his life sentence. And almost 1 year after he was captured, Allan Legere was formally charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. Investigators said they waited a year before charging him because of the complicated laboratory testing of evidence. Back in 1990, DNA evidence was still a relatively new technology in Canada, and the Legere trial was to be a test case. While DNA typing had been used in courts in the United States and Britain, it had never been tested in a Canadian murder case. The trial of Allan Legere would begin on August 26, 1991, and over 500 prospective jurors were contacted for jury duty. This was 10 times the usual number, and a legal record for the province. An auditorium had to be booked to screen jurors, as no courthouse in New Brunswick could hold them all. After Legere was transferred from the Atlantic Institution to stand trial, he was placed in the basement of the Fredericton jail, in a cell normally reserved to punish prisoners. This was done primarily to prevent another escape attempt. The prosecution would open their case by calling it a giant jigsaw puzzle of circumstantial evidence. But the star of the trial would be the DNA evidence. Semen samples from the victims' bodies matched samples of Legere's hair and blood. The defense almost immediately started attacking the DNA evidence, saying that many people in the Miramichi were related in some way to Legere, and that genetic inbreeding had created a pool of people with similar DNA, therefore making DNA fingerprinting impossible. Remember, DNA was in its infancy in the late 80s, early 90s, so this type of defense back in the day didn't seem as crazy as it does now. Throughout his trial, Legere would have random outbursts that usually resulted in Justice David Dixon kicking him out. One of these expulsions was during a genetic expert's testimony. Legere would be forced to watch his murder trial in his cell on closed-circuit TV for 3 days before being allowed back in court. The trial would last 9 weeks, and the prosecution called more than 240 witnesses. And then on November 3, 1991, an 11-member jury returned with 4 guilty verdicts of first-degree murder and sentenced Legere to life in prison. Again, Legere was unapologetic, and following the verdict, said that he was planning to launch his appeal, and it should be no surprise that he was also caught plotting another escape attempt. In December, shortly after his murder convictions, Legere was transferred from a prison in New Brunswick to a prison in Quebec, which had tighter security. From there, he was placed in protective custody and was confined to his cell 23 hours a day and allowed 1 hour for exercise. Legere was never one to step down from a fight and retaliated with a lawsuit against the Canadian government in 1998. He apparently wanted $30,000 because, in his words, he wasn't protected in prison. In 1994, he was stabbed 7 times by a fellow inmate and claimed that prison officials ignored his warnings and failed to prevent the stabbing, and asked the court to award him damages for his pain and suffering. The federal government didn't contest that Legere was stabbed, but maintained that they weren't liable. Meanwhile, after serving almost 20 years in prison, Todd Matchett, one of Legere's accomplices in the Glendenning murder, was granted day parole at the age of 37. He would apologize to the Glendenning family and tell them he felt bad for what he was a part of, and if he could ever go back and change things, he would. A few years later, in 2009, Legere's other accomplice, Scott Curtis, was granted full parole. However, he would pass away in 2019 at the age of 52. Legere remained in the Supermax Special Handling Unit in Quebec until 2015, when Correctional Services Canada transferred him to a maximum security prison. As of today, Allan Legere is 75 years old and still behind bars. He's been eligible to apply for day parole since 2012 and full parole since 2015, but has been rejected each time because he remains a risk. According to his file, Legere was diagnosed with antisocial and narcissistic disorders and obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. He also scores high on the psychopathy checklist. At his most recent parole hearing in 2021, he blamed everyone except himself for the murders and said that he wanted to return to New Brunswick to be near his family. He still refuses to take responsibility and would only admit to being present in the area, but that he didn't kill anyone. He said he was only in the Miramichi to dig up the stolen money that he had buried. When asked by a parole board member if he's reminded in any way of the pain and suffering he had caused, Legere said, quote, "Yes, I understand that part, but why can't they forgive me? Why can't they forget?" Never one to back down from attempting to manipulate the system, Legere appealed after being denied parole, alleging bias by 2 female members of the board. This appeal, of course, wouldn't go anywhere. It's been 34 years since the man once known as the Monster of the Miramichi terrorized the tiny region of New Brunswick. Journalist and author Rick McLean, who wrote the book Terror, Murder and Panic in New Brunswick and Terror's End, Allan Legere on Trial, said that the memories of violence committed by Legere are like a scar tissue on the community's psyche. Adam Lorden, the mayor of Miramichi, said that the parole board's decision was a huge relief to the community. Quote, "This means we can relax a little bit again until the next time." Thank you so much for watching and taking the time to hang out with me today. If you enjoyed learning about this case, please be sure to like and subscribe. If there's a case you would like me to cover in a future video, let me know in the comment section down below. To support my channel, you can go to Buy Me a Coffee if you would like to donate. Thanks again, and I will see you next time.